In the first chapter of The One-Dimensional Man, called The New Forms of Control, Marcuse critically talks about an unfreedom called the freedom of enterprise, a freedom that is characterized by hard labor, toil, and precarity. This freedom of enterprise, i.e., the freedom to work and engage in business activities, leaves us with the option of extremes of either working or starving, which is imposed on us by the technological and political apparatus in advanced industrial societies like the UK, the US, and European countries. So take your pick and choose wisely, because your choice is the difference between whether you sink or swim. Marcuse talks about the freedom of enterprise as an unfreedom that forces the individual to constantly carry out work imposed on us by society, as we show ourselves worthy of the market by going to work to toil every day. And this is true, but I think, to quote, prove yourself on the market, end quote, as Marcuse put it, would require you to be in a precarious or insecure employment, work unpredictable hours, work ridiculously long hours, and make that dreaded journey home on a crammed tube. Marcuse goes on to say that if this kind of freedom, i.e., the freedom to work and do business, is eliminated, then it would be the, quote, greatest achievement of civilization, end quote. And the individual is free beyond just struggling for necessary needs, and are free to have autonomy over their lives. In essence, in Marcuse's own words, freedom beyond necessity. However, there is a condition attached to this realization of liberation from work. Marcuse puts that this freedom can only come about if the productive apparatus, i.e., technology used to produce and distribute goods and services, is centralized and geared towards satisfying vital needs. He was positive that such possibility of centralization would not prevent individual autonomy, but only render it possible. Alas, Marcuse, however, was pessimistic about this reality of satisfaction of vital needs through centralization ever coming into existence, because, according to him, industrial society is totalitarian and our free time is used up by economic, political requirements. He defines totalitarian in this context as a, quote, non-terroristic coordination that functions through the manipulation of needs and prevents the opposition against the whole, end quote. In essence, we cannot achieve, quote, liberation beyond necessity, end quote, because there are vested interests who sustain the current status quo by manipulating our needs. It is now important for me to emphasize that the theme that I've been discussing, the theme around the freedom of enterprise, is not reflective of the first chapter of this book. It is, however, reflective of the first few pages of the book that I've read. And I think that it is important for me to stress that, and I will discuss the remaining themes that I have found in this first chapter, called The New Forms of Control. I don't think that I'm convinced that, with the argument that when we centralize them into production or the productive apparatus, that we are within the realms of the possibility around achieving autonomy beyond necessity. I don't think that argument holds water for me. I think that if only you look to history to take a look at an example of the Soviet Union, headed by Russia, and to see how, when centralization was enacted via um, the modality of collectivization, you begin to realize that it is not necessarily the case that autonomy is an end product. In fact, the opposite is the case, where there is this repression of rights. That rights are being repressed. And for example, in the case of the kulaks, who were under Stalin, right after he enacted the 5-year plan, which aimed to industrialize Russia. So you see, there is also always like an intent, a good intent to industrialize Russia, for example, and you know, and Mercury's intent or goal of achieving autonomy beyond necessity. But it usually normally comes at the cost of lives, when you intend to centralize the resources that is utilized to um, produce goods and services via technology. I think once we head down that journey, it is not a smooth journey. It's one that's slippery. And the story of the kulaks and the wealthy peasants, such a contradiction, I think. A very paradoxical term, wealthy peasants. Once they started to realize that this policy would come at the cost of their sovereignty. They would be required to release their lands. The 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 policy did not leave this collectivization to the will of these people. It came down ultimately to force. They were being forcefully stripped of their lands, just to fund this goal of industrialization. So this kulak class and peasants were being forced to collectivize their wealth and farms and work, toil, just so that they can meet the requirements of Stalin, which Stalin needed to, in fairness, fund his goal of industrialization. Productivity needed to go up in order to fund the import of machineries and all and what have you, but and to fund the increase in labor, industrialized labor, and it had to come from somewhere. So these poor people had to, slave away for hours on farms, just so that most of the profits can go to Stalin to fund whatever agenda he has for Russia. And so we quickly see over time that these kulak class were, were suppressed. They each time they stood up against Stalin, we have these people thrown into prisons, labor camps. They were fined if they didn't comply. If they didn't produce enough, they were fined. If they did, they were given beautiful lands, high quality lands. If you didn't meet the quotas, you were given stupid lands. It was all just labor camps with prisoners in them and working for some feudal lord. And so that is the implication. When you centralize, you leave power to certain people to dictate, how the means of production is allocated, or or how wealth is allocated, and how productivity is established. So that is one critique I have with this argument. The second critique I have, I think, is, or rather, a modern example of how collectivization does not necessarily work to produce autonomy, is the Singaporean case study. Ever since the 1960s, when the Housing Development Board decided to produce public housing, I think it did very well for Singapore. I think 80% of Singaporeans have ownership. I think Singapore has one of the highest home ownership rates in the world. and it is something to be applauded, I think. But the Housing Acquisition Act by the government ensured that private lands, were forcefully taken away for public use. So that's to fund the public housing, and I don't know what the paperwork's like. Maybe those people were compensated very greatly, but you know, despite the fact that most Singaporeans who are really um, largely non-residents have access to housing, public housing, did not stop, the fact that there was still a high criteria to meet before you can afford housing. Those who are single 21-year-olds, for example, or 30, if you're single, you don't meet the threshold to have access to housing in Singapore. You have to rent, and those subsidized housing were for married couples. And you have to be until you're 35 to, as a single person, to have our housing. And also, those the experience of access to public housing for those who are gay isn't the same as those who are straight. So you have these issues around allocation of resources when centralization comes into play. Housing has now become so expensive. The cost is going up. The price to income ratio, of housing in Singapore is really high. The cost of renting has gone up because the value of housing has gone up, and whilst the incomes of these people have stagnated. So we now have an issue whereby this said country with the highest rate of home ownership in the world has an increase in renters struggling to pay for their rents. We have an issue whereby the government, rather than building more houses on demand, it's building housing to order, whereby they build housing only after 70% of it has been pre-sold. Further exacerbating this housing issue in Singapore. So we have, in essence, a case whereby centralization of means of production, in this case housing, the productive apparatus, in this case the resources used to provide housing, land, machineries, have not exactly yielded autonomy for these people. Those singles and millennials who are currently suffering as a result of the high increase in housing, and who are potentially going to be homeless. We have these people still fighting for necessities. It hasn't guaranteed freedom beyond necessity. There is still a struggle towards necessity because, of scarcity. We need to understand that we have not gotten to the stage where technology ramps up productivity to the point where we get to a post-scarcity world. Shout out to Aaron Bastani in his book Luxury Communism. I don't think we're there yet. I think we still need more time, and we also have to take into consideration the scarcity of resources. And how do we allocate resources when we centralized? Who determines who gets what? In the case, as we've seen in Singapore. So I think I have to end my discussion here and my analysis here, and conclude that although Marcuse's mind, I think, is in the right direction, we do need to ensure freedom beyond autonomy. I don't think I want to slave away for hours for someone else. I think I'm tired of it. I think you are probably too. I do have things I want to do with my life for most of my life, but calling for centralization of power, of the means of production, I don't think is a very viable way to go, at least for now. And that centralization of power does not guarantee autonomy. We haven't seen an issue where centralization produces necessity beyond it produces autonomy beyond necessity. In every country we still that has centralized, necessities are still being sought after, and I don't think that screams freedom. So in the next video, I'm going to carry on, talking about the remaining themes that I have found in Marcuse's first chapter, called the social new forms of control. I hope you watch this next video, and bye.